I am Judge Susan Peck, and I'm here today to interview Judge Frederica Brenneman for the Connecticut Bar Foundation's Oral History of Connecticut Women in the Legal Profession. And since this is an oral history project, we're going to start at the beginning and ask you, Judge Brenneman, when you were born and where you were born.
I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, on July 10th, 1926, if you want to know everything.
And tell us about your parents and your background and a little bit about the other members of your family as you were growing up.
My father was a newspaper man who had gone to the University of Michigan. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky. He'd come up to Michigan to go to college and somehow never got out of Ann Arbor. My mother was born and raised in Detroit, and they were both really writers. They met while editing papers in Detroit. And I have one sister who's 3.5 years older, and she also was a writer, a newspaper woman for a number of years. And there were three distinguishing features of thinking about it growing up. One was to grow up in a college town where you could be poor, and in the Depression everybody was poor, but everybody had a college education that was first rate. And I think I had mentioned to you before, the only cleaning women we ever had were graduate students who were working their way through to their PhDs. That was a salient thing. Education was, you didn't question you were going to go to college. Second thing was that it was during the Depression, and in some ways, looking back on it, things that were important were emphasized at a time when material things could not be emphasized. The third thing that I think was really a formative thing for me is that I went to a school, university school, that was sort of a lab school for education grad students. So from 7th through 12th grade, there were the same 50 kids, 25 boys, 25 girls, few in, few out every year, but basically the same group. We grew up together. We met at age 11. We parted at 18 to go our different ways to college. And when you're one of a class of 50 or one of 25 girls, you count for something. You know, during all those difficult years of adolescence, you're 1/25th of all the girls in that class. And I can't help but believe that that did a lot to make me comfortable with who I was and to give me more self-confidence than if I had gone to a great big high school where if you weren't the queen of the prom, you were sunk.
So I guess there was never any doubt that you would go on to college.
No, that wasn't even discussed.
And but your mother did not work.
My mother didn't, well, actually, she did. She was a housewife until the war came, and in 1940, the University of Michigan Medical School prepared to send a whole hospital unit to England, and my mother, who had learned shorthand and typing because her brothers, who had the money to send her to college, didn't think women should go to college in the 20s, my mother volunteered to get the hospital unit off, and when she completed that job, the head of the Department of Surgery at the University of Michigan Medical School hired her as his executive secretary, and she proceeded to have 20 years of this glorious career working for doctors and medical students and starting foundations, and it was a very fulfilling latter part of her adult years.
And how old were you when that came about?
In 1941, I was in senior high school, and when she worked full-time, I was off to college. So that's what women in those days did.
Now, how did you go about choosing your college?
Well, it's sort of funny because I think my father chose, although he worked in a Detroit paper, he chose to live in Ann Arbor because he thought his girls would at least go to college, no matter how poor we were. And in fact, I think tuition when my sister went was $60 either a semester or a year. I had an uncle who had gone to Harvard and the Harvard Law School, so I knew there was some school back in Boston. And I applied for a regional scholarship, which nobody had applied for about 5 years. And I got it, so that was enough money for the whole first year at Radcliffe. Also, I have to tell you that in my high school class of 25 girls, I think 3 went to Smith and 1 went to Vassar, so that the 7 sisters, as we used to call them, were not foreign to us. And I wanted to get away from home.
And how old were you when you went off to college?
Well, this was during the war, 1943, and Harvard, as many colleges, had gone on around the year, so I started in July, And my birthday wasn't until July 10th, and I left Ann Arbor July 1st so that I could tell my grandchildren I went to college when I was 16. I turned 17, of course, 10 days later.
And you had, I know you told me a very interesting, what I thought was a really kind of an adventurous, interesting story about you setting off for college.
Yeah, a woman that I'm very fond of said that you haven't really done your job as a mother unless your children can leave home without a pang. Well, I guess my parents did a heck of a good job because on July 1st of 1943, in the middle of World War II, the big Michigan Central trains came through from Chicago to the East Coast, full of soldiers, young men in uniforms. And my parents and I got early to the Union Station in Ann Arbor, or Michigan, whatever it was called, and waited for that train. And when the train came in, it was crawling with soldiers and me and my two brand new white suitcases. And I got on a sleeper car because, of course, my parents wouldn't let me sit up. And they told me what to do, that I should get to South Station, take a taxi to Cabot Hall in Radcliffe College. And it all worked out as they described. And within the first 15 minutes, I met a classmate who is still my friend. And I was off and running and having an absolutely wonderful time. It never occurred to me to call up my parents and tell them that I had arrived safely. They had to send a friend of mine who happened to be visiting in Boston to knock on my door of Cabot Hall 3 days later to say, "Your parents are frantic. Are you alive?" So I think my parents did a good job. On the other hand, it shows how selfish I was at 17.
And had you ever worked, at all as a teenager?
Not during school. We lived in the country, and my school day was very long. I didn't get home till about 5 o'clock. But I'd worked in the summers occasionally in a friend's clothing store, selling things, saying it looks lovely on you, madam.
And how did you spent 4 years at Radcliffe?
I did, actually. It was less than that because we went 3 semesters the first year. I took the 2 summers off, so I actually finished in February of 47 instead of June.
And how did you settle on your major?
I'm not sure. I think it was my father's influence again. The Depression made a big impression on him and on all of us. And I think I wanted to understand how it had happened and what we might do so it wouldn't happen again. Looking back on it now in this era of sort of unparalleled and kind of shocking prosperity, it's hard to remember how deeply that Depression experience affected the kids who were growing up at that time. But I remember in my little homemade prayers at night, I'd pray that everybody's daddy didn't lose their jobs.
And did you have a plan? Did you have any idea at that point, while you were in college, what you had hoped to do with that major?
I didn't have any clear picture. I wanted to understand the Depression and probably work in some kind of governmental capacity, toward alleviating this kind of a risk again. I happened to do very well in economics. I don't know why. I understand the entire football team at the University of Colorado majors in economics, so I'm not sure that's anything to be so proud of. But it enabled me to get a very good academic record. I'm not terribly proud of that because I avoided a lot of subjects that I wish I had taken, like philosophy and the history of art and things that I was nervous about because I didn't know anything about them. But I wasn't clear about what I wanted to do with it, and it was only after I graduated that I realized that I did not want to get a PhD in economics, that would be sort of death to my life. But
what are your fondest memories about your college experience, your undergraduate experience?
I think the freedom to be able to make my own decisions. They still had parietal rules for girls, and we had separate dormitories and had to be in at a certain time. But when you were a senior, if you were on the dean's list, you could make your own hours and stay out as late as you wanted. And I remember my roommate and I going to the corner drugstore on Mass Ave and Shepherd Street and preaching the communist doctrine to the soda jerk just because we would like to hear ourselves say, "You have nothing to lose but your chains," just so we could stay out until midnight. But The friends I made there, who are still my closest friends, the discovery of Boston, we didn't spend much time in Boston. Even Cambridge itself is just such a rich load of wonderful things, wonderful adventures. The intellectual stimulation of realizing that there were so many people who had so many ideas living in a close community. It was just, it was heaven for me, and I'm kind of surprised I didn't pick an academic life, because I was raised in Ann Arbor, and I came of age in Cambridge, and that was, I think if I hadn't been blocked about writing a PhD thesis, I might have been an academic.
Now, were you involved in extracurricular kinds of college activities at all?
That's a very interesting question, because in high school I had been Little Miss Activities Girls. I was the lead in the plays and the editor of the paper and that sort of thing. I started that when I got to college, and I quickly looked around and found out that that was not being done. Radcliffe was going through a tremendous transformation at that time, because after my first semester, the summer of '43, all of my classes were with men. Unlike the other women's colleges that were very isolated, Cambridge, the men at Harvard just changed their khakis for sailor suits, and so all of my classes were, V-12 and Naval ROTC men, and the women at Radcliffe. And it was a very yeasty time to be there. So, we did some work at USO canteens, dancing with the men who had come back on leave and that sort of thing. But I didn't do anything with the theater or the newspaper. I did participate in the founding of Radio Radcliffe, and I think the capstone of my career was that I found out that something like The Pit and the Pendulum could be read in just 29 minutes. So every time they had an empty half hour, they'd ask me to come back and read The Pit and the Pendulum.
Now, you graduated from Radcliffe in 1947, I think you said.
Right.
And then what did you do after that?
Unlike kids in college nowadays who graduate without a clue about what they're going to do the next month, being a child of the Depression, I had to feel that my job was lined up before I graduated. So with some, I don't know whether it was influenced through my father or not, but I got a job at the newly formed International Monetary Fund in Washington, working on the magazine that was going to be published. We were working on compiling basic tables of gold and foreign exchange transactions. And I was there for a year. I had no clue about what I was doing, but my partner in this endeavor was a beautiful redhead from Washington, and she and I had jolly times, but I was living in a sort of pension. I didn't know anybody really in Washington, and I began going up to New York every weekend to visit my college friends, and that's why a year later I moved to New York.
And where did you live in New York?
Lived in the West Village, which at that time was very inexpensive and fun. Things sort of fell into place for me at the same moment that my college roommate's family had gotten an apartment on Bank Street. A job application in the federal government came through for me with a job in New York, which was amazing, doing public relations for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which published the cost of living index every month. And so I was in the public relations part that transmitted that information to labor unions and people that needed it for contracts and that sort of thing.
And so you had an apartment then in the...
So February of '47, I had an apartment in the Village and a job on the West Side. I never had to take the subway. I just took the bus up and the bus down. I don't think I got up above 34th Street more than a couple of times in 3 years.
And how long did you stay in New York?
Almost 3 years, from February of '48 until October of '50.
And how did you come to leave New York?
Well, it was sort of the same story. I mean, when I was living in D.C., I kept looking yearningly at New York. So when I was living in New York, it quickly became apparent to me that my particular job at the BLS was kind of a dead end, and I'd need to go on and find something else. At that time, women got married routinely right after they exchanged their graduation gown for a wedding gown.
So we were around, what, 1950 at this point?
48, 49.
Okay.
And the men who had gone off and missed 2 or 3 years of college in World War II, as soon as they graduated in 47 or 48, wanted to marry and have a family and do all the catching up that they couldn't do. So I was not married, and I figured, well, at 24, I thought, if I'm going to be an old maid, I might as well have a more interesting job and maybe make better money and a more interesting professional life than I was leading. So I began looking yearningly back to Cambridge. And one of my college buddies with whom I studied economics had gone on to get her PhD, was working on it, and I used to go up and visit her. And that's a story, Susan, that you might be interested in. This woman was very bright and really liked economics, and she knocked on the door of the Harvard Business School in 1946, saying, I would like to go. And they said, you're eminently well qualified, but you're a woman. Sorry. So she went back across the river to get her PhD in economics. And visiting her, I realized, I don't want to do this. I do not want to spend months in libraries compiling figures. But on the other hand, I loved the idea of studying in Cambridge. And so that's when the fortuity of the Harvard Law School opening up to women changed my life.
And that was actually the first, your class was actually the first Harvard Law School class that accepted women.
That's right, 1950. I mean, after all of the rest, I think it might have been the last. I mean, Yale had taken women for years, so had Columbia. But I was visiting my economics friend and happened to have breakfast with some guys that I had known as undergraduates, and they were both at the law school. And they were saying it's really great, it's much more fun than undergraduate school. And I said, gee, that's great, I wish they let women in. And they said, the Boston Globe that morning had just said Harvard would let in its first class of women that fall. And I said, oh, that's an interesting thought. And they said, apply. And I said, I've never thought about it. But they marched me to the admissions office and asked for an application, which the Harvard Law School didn't have, because for the first time in its 150-year history, it had to go back to the printers for little boxes for sex, which it never had to have before. Then, of course, I sort of fantasized that, a few years later they had to send it back to the printers to get the little boxes taken off for gender-blind admissions. And then they had to send it back for more little boxes for affirmative action for women, because they had a hard time getting over about 20. We were 13 in the class that entered in 1950. I think it remained that small or even smaller up to the early 70s.
And so you were one of 13 in a class of how many?
In our class was something like 550. There were 1,557 men at the Harvard Law School in the fall of 50, and 13 of us.
13 women. And had you ever, up until that point in time, considered the law as a profession?
I hate to tell you. That's why I said I'm not a good role model for
No,
women
you're a
attorneys.
great role
I had not thought of it. When I heard that the law school was letting in women, my first impulse was, I can go back to Cambridge for 3 years and not write a thesis. And then I thought, from what I've heard about the study of law sounds like something that interested me. You're reading cases about people. And I think that's the thing about economics that essentially turned me off, that I am interested in people and not in statistics. And then, as my friends had said, the moment I got to law school, I realized this was exactly the right thing for me. But you have to think about the hand of fate or something.
Well, what was it? When you say it was exactly the right thing for you, what was it about the law that...
I loved studying cases, IDS and wife, A hits B and C is standing behind and is pregnant, and can D, the fetus, recover from A? To me, this is fascinating. This is about people. I also liked the way it was studied, that we would have these huge classes, but still there would be interaction between the professors and the students. And then we would study in small groups, and I was in a group with 2 or 3 other people, men, and it was just a very interesting way to study to me, is to talk. As you can see, I like to talk.
And how did your family feel about or react, if they did, to your going to law school, to the idea of you going to law school and becoming a lawyer?
I think they approved. My father, I don't know whether you'd say he was a feminist or a cynic, but his basic attitude was, and mind you, mine was a generation where women went to college, but then married, had kids, and stayed home, at least for 20 years. And he felt this was not appropriate. He felt that women should have a way of making their own livings and having their own lives, because you couldn't count on men. He said, if you're going to stay home and raise children and cook, go to cooking school. So I think he approved of my selecting a profession that would lead to an interesting life, hopefully, and the ability to support myself with or without a husband.
And tell us what it was like to be one in that first class of women. I know there's been a lot of wonderful things that have happened because you were in that first class.
Oh yes, and we're
one
so
of 17.
celebrated now by the Harvard Law School. In fact, Amy and I had our pictures on the cover of the last Harvard Law School alumni bulletin. And if that is not a breakthrough for an organization that wouldn't let women in for the last, up till 1950. Our attitude was basically the attitude of women in the 50s. It wasn't, how dare you guys have kept us out until 1950. It was, thank you. And we didn't complain that in order to go to the bathroom, we had to crawl through the steam tunnels, you know, from Austin, or to Austin Hall from the big hall, because there's only one ladies' room, and there are only 13 women. Why should there be more than one ladies' room? We just accepted that. We accepted the fact that there was no campus housing for the women. There were dorms, but they were for the men.
And so where did you live when you went to
I
law
lived with my
school?
friend who was getting her PhD in economics.
And how did the men in the class respond to you or react to you or treat you?
Well, I had a somewhat unique introduction. If I can go back a little bit, having applied to Harvard Law School and gotten in, I suddenly thought, you know, going to law school is a good idea for me, but why should I leave my lovely apartment and roommates in New York? So I applied to NYU and Columbia and got in, because in those days one did. And then I had this terrible indecision. Should I stay in New York and go to law school, or cut my ties with New York and go up to Cambridge? And the time to enter school came and went. And all three schools were sitting there scratching their heads saying, is she coming or isn't she? Until this fortuity that I think I told you about, where we were having a little gathering at my apartment, and I said to my roommates and their friends, what'll I do, what'll I do? And one of my roommates said, oh, I have a birthday book, you know, with little slogans. And so she looked up July 10th. And the slogan for July 10th was, there is a tide in the affairs of men which taken at the flood leads to victory. That did it. I'm not kidding. That did it. So I packed my suitcase and I got to Harvard Law School 3 weeks late. And they had, you know, orientation for all the new people. The dean and his wife, who was a charming person, Dean Griswold and his wife, had a reception for the women. The women had gotten to know each other to some extent. I walked in cold in the first class, and the first class was something pretty opaque, like torts or something. And they presented the typical case method thing, you know, A hits B and C has a miscarriage and so forth. Can D recover from B? And then the bell rang and everybody picked up their things and started to leave. And I said to the young man next to me, well, what's the answer? And he looked at me as if I were crazy, and I realized this is law school.
And how did there were no women on the faculty, I take it, at the time?
I don't believe so. They had had a couple of visiting women professors in the past. I should remember their names, but I don't. But there were no tenured women. And that's still a sore point. It still lags way behind where it should be on tenured women.
So how did the professors, I mean, law school professors, particularly first-year professors, are notoriously hard on students. And how were they, you know, there's that wonderful old TV show that they had of that classic.
1L, yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't find that they were particularly hard. The wonderful thing I discovered is that the professor had a seating chart, and he would call out to any name on the seating chart, you know, Miss Peck, so forth. What's the answer to that? You could always say not prepared. You know, they didn't mark you down for that.
Wow.
Everything was on your 3 or 4 hour exam. So when I discovered you could say not prepared, and I don't think they ever called on me, actually. So I didn't find that they were hard at all.
So that you didn't feel that you were singled out by your teachers?
No, I think that came a little bit later. One professor, W. Barton Leach, who was the most brilliant property professor. I understand that he would sort of victimize women. He would have the men bring their dates for the weekend to his Saturday morning classes, and he would sort of single out the women. He alone made one comment when I came back my second year, and I had married Russell in this summer between first and second year. The following March, Professor Leach, on a cold and nasty day, said, "Would somebody close the windows? We don't want to give the little family in the back row colds." That was the only comment that was ever made about my being a woman or about my being married, or, you know, it was the first law school marriage as far as I know. That was the only thing that was ever said.
So how did you meet your husband?
Well, I owe it all to the Korean War, I guess. I guess it was in civil procedure, and Russell was sitting on the aisle, and then there was a guy named Schaefer, and there's me. And Schaefer and I began to chat. I got there in October. We began to chat in November and December. When I came back after Christmas holidays, Schaefer's seat was empty. He was in the Marine Reserves, and he had been called up to go to Korea. So there was Russell Brenneman, empty seat, and me. And we began.
Was it alphabetical or
No.
no?
No.
No.
At least that row wasn't. So we made a few little remarks. I borrowed his notes once when I missed a class, and we began to see each other a little bit. But that was like January. I think we went out in April and got married in July. So I'm not sure it'll work out. We'll be 50 next July, but you can't ever tell.
Right. And and you finished law school in 3. You were married after your first year in law school.
Right. And so we had 2 wonderful years together, studying together. Some of our courses were different, but being together all the time. And then, because of the Korean War, Russell had to take a qualifying exam every spring to make sure he could come back the following fall. And in 1953, we did not stick around Cambridge to march and get our diplomas from the Harvard Law School. Was looking back on it, was really a disservice to the family members who had helped us financially. But Russell had wanted to take the earliest bar exam he could so that he could apply for a JAG commission and then be able to support me, which is what husbands in the 50s were supposed to do.
Right.
So we both left Cambridge the minute our last exam was over, went down to the cram course in the District of Columbia because the D.C. bar was the first to be given. And we took that bar and passed it, but nothing happened with JAG. And so we came back to Cambridge and just kind of worked, not at law jobs really. We were both working, doing research for the Ford Foundation, just kind of waiting to see if JAG would come through before the draft did. And I was applying for jobs in Boston law firms, and Russell was drafted, and I worked in a Boston law firm for 4 months and then quit to join him where he was in the Army.
And where was he?
Well, because he had passed the D.C. bar, he was put into the Corps of Engineers and wound up in Washington, D.C., I'm not sure what he was doing at the Corps of Engineers, but eventually he got sent out to Columbus, Ohio, where his family was, where they had an engineering storage parts depot where millions of nuts and bolts were stored, and any engineer who wanted a particular nut or bolt from all over the world would, I guess, call up Columbus, and they would go right. Now, Russell and I are the kind of people, we can't find a pen that we just signed the check with, you know, so this was kind of amusing. And I couldn't get a law job because we knew that that was temporary. So we kind of did this temporary thing for a year. Then his JAG commission came through, and after training at Fort Benning, where I followed him, and also the University of Virginia, he was stationed at the Pentagon, and then I got my first real job at the Department of Justice.
Now I know you've made this comment that you were a bride of the 50s. So I guess that there was never any doubt that you would go where Russell had the opportunities.
None. Made it much simpler. I mean, nowadays families are in terrible. I mean, your job has more fringes than my job. You know, where should we go? Your job is or my job? No question.
And when you did work in that law firm in Boston. How did that come about? How did you get that job?
I got it through the placement office at Harvard, and looking back on it, how they fixed my salary was demeaning to an extreme. They sat me down and figured out my costs. I was still living in student housing in Cambridge, what I would pay for groceries, Russell was drafted, what I needed for transportation, et cetera, what I would get as a private's wife, and then they paid me the difference of what I would need. That was demeaning of me. On the other hand, they knew darn well that I would quit the minute that I could join my husband, because brides of the 50s did that. I didn't lie and say I wouldn't. They didn't ask me. They were gentlemen. I think it was probably I was worth the modest amount that they paid me.
Now, what type of firm was this?
It was basically a tiny firm that had one client who was a great chain of grocery stores, you know, so they were doing contracts and employment. I don't know what they were doing. I was only there for 4 months. I mean, you know, in private practice, I don't think you're worth anything for
Now,
the
did you
first
take
year.
the Massachusetts bar?
Yes, yeah.
So,
I did that. That's what I did when Russell was drafted. And I passed the Massachusetts bar. And then, of course, we wound up living in Connecticut, so we both took the Connecticut bar. So I'm pretty good at taking bar exams.
bar exams. All right, can we take a little break? Seems like a good time.
Is it going too slowly? We're only up to
No, I think
1956.
I think it's going fine. Now, you graduated from Harvard Law School in 1953,
Right.
and all 13 of the women graduated?
Actually, it was 12, and there was some difference. One of our number took a year off to have a baby, and she graduated in 54. One of our number disappeared after the first year. I don't know what happened to her. And then I think we had a transfer in, so we were 12, but not exactly the same.
And do you know what's happened to your law school classmates? How their careers have...
Yeah, I'm in touch with pretty much all of them. One of them had been a classmate of mine at Radcliffe, and she wound up working as an attorney for the federal government until she retired fairly recently. Several of them had practices with family members. One of them did not practice. She had quite a large number of children and is running a family business. So they've all done something in the law, as far as I know. One of them became a librarian for the rare book collection at the Harvard Law School.
And you keep in touch?
Yeah, we keep in touch with each other, sort of. But the all women's reunions, which began in 1978, brings us all together now every 5 years, along with all the women that followed us, and that's been a wonderful adventure.
And what was the genesis of that?
Well, in 1978, spearheaded by a woman who was a third-year law student named Sheila Kuhl, who came to fame as Dobie Gillis's girlfriend in the television series and who's now a member of the state legislature in California, they decided that we should be celebrated. They had not thought to celebrate us in the year that they came, 25 years after the first class arrived in 1975, but they thought of it in time for 25 years after the first class of women graduated in 1953. And so we had an all-women's reunion, the first one in 1978. There were 300 women from all the classes during those 25 years, and at that time 300 women who were at the Harvard Law School. And it was kind of curious because in 1978, I think the emergence of women in the practice of law has taken different forms, you know. And in 1978, it was still in the early form of, we are just as good as guys, treat us just like guys, make us partners, we will pretend that we don't have babies and buy groceries and that sort of thing. And that was the, I think, attitude in 78, because I asked one of the women who had organized it, how come none of the 12 of us who graduated were invited to be on the planning committee or to be on any of the panels during this 3 days of celebration? And she said, I thought a little embarrassed, well, we wanted to give you a weekend off. But I think they didn't want to hear my kind of attitude. Gee, fellas, thanks for having at least one bathroom, even though it's a quarter of a mile away from classes. And, thank you for giving me a job, even though you're only paying me the difference between a private's wife's and my expenses. They didn't want that attitude. They were, we demand equal rights. But it was very interesting because the next reunion was 10 years later, 1988. By that time, women were pretty firmly established in law firms and in the management part of law firms, and they were beginning to realize that these decisions have to be addressed. I mean, who's going to take care of your kids and who takes time off? And suddenly we were very popular. We were asked to, be on the panels, and people would come up to me and say, how did you manage the 3 kids and the law practice and that sort of thing? What did you do about daycare and that sort of thing? And we were very popular. And it was a much mellower atmosphere, much more balanced in 1988. We decided we couldn't wait 10 years. So now we meet every 5 years. And the last time was in 1998, which was really a wonderful celebration with Janet Reno and Justice Ginsburg and Lanny Guinier. It was just a great time.
That's great. Now, if we can get back to Connecticut, because it was actually your third bar admission was in Connecticut.
Right.
Right.
My husband got out of the Army in 1956 and went to the Harvard placement office. We had spent one summer as a hired couple in Vermont, and we had no clear picture of the practice of law. We thought it'd be kind of fun to have a ma and pa law firm in a place like White River Junction or something. Mm-hmm. But there were no small towns in New England that wanted us, but a very small firm in Torrington, Connecticut was looking for a lawyer. And so we left Washington, D.C., where we were living in a very yuppie townhouse in Old Town Alexandria, and both of us working full-time and making lots of money, to go up and live in a 1790 farmhouse at the end of a half-mile driveway. Well, I think our income was diminished by 2/3 that first year in 1956. But we were not looking for money. The practice of law, and I think the temper of the times was very different. We were looking for a way of life, and that's how we wound up in Connecticut.
And at some point you got sworn in to the bar. You took the bar exam.
We took the bar exam, and we both passed, and we were sworn in, I think, in 56, sometime in 56.
And
that's right.
At that time you were sworn in New Haven. Is that where?
I don't remember whether it was in New Haven. I think perhaps it was. I know we took the cram course. I guess so.
Now, were you in a large group of people that were being sworn in? In other words, did you get sworn in with the group, the fall group of
I don't
folks
remember
that take the
that.
bar exam in July?
I don't remember that. All I know is somebody gave me a statistic that the number of people that passed the bar last year was equal to the number of people practicing law in Connecticut in 1956. So I think the numbers were very different then.
And so I take it then that when you started practicing law in Connecticut, that there weren't very many other women out there.
No, there weren't. There was Catherine Rohrbach, who was already well known in northwestern Connecticut, which is where we were living. There was Ellen Burns, who was then the legislative commissioner, and I think I might have been considered for a job with her, which I, now looking back on it, would have loved. But in 1956, with my husband out of the Army, we assumed we would immediately have the requisite 2 boys and 2 girls. And so I stayed home waiting to get pregnant. Only life is full of mysteries, and we didn't have our first child till 1960.
And so for that period of time, you did not work?
Well, I don't know whether you call it working or not. Russell's little law firm would hire me by the hour to search titles in the funny little town halls, where if the town clerk was drunk between 1880 and 1895, there weren't any land records and that sort of thing. And doing a few little estate plans, but nothing of any great importance.
And then you began having children in 1960. And how many children do you have?
I had, first child was born in 1960, and the second in 1961, just a year and 9 days later. And then we moved to Essex. My husband got a job in New London. And I continued to work at his law firms doing the little 2-day-a-week things that I was doing before. And then Amy was born in 1964 when we lived in Essex.
And so when you just got a babysitter, when your older two were...
Yeah, they didn't have anything like daycare in those days. I mean, you got high school dropouts, or in Essex we had a wonderful older woman who had raised children who would come in. And I remember when we moved to Essex, my mother-in-law, who was a very wise lady, said, the first thing to do is to find out a babysitter. Then you find out where you buy milk and where the doctor is. I'm sorry about this.
That's okay. Take your time. Are you okay?
Yep.
And at some point, well, what did you do? At some point, you started engaging yourself in other types of activities.
Yeah. Let's see. When Amy was, I guess when Amy was 2, I went on the Essex School Board. And Essex at that time was a very Republican town. And the fact that I was a Democrat, with good academic credentials, serving on the school board, led the Democratic Town Committee to ask if I would run for probate judge. And the probate judge was a very reputable lawyer. Many probate judges were not in those days. He was. And I said, and the Democrats had always endorsed him up to now, but they wanted to run a full slate. So I said, yeah, I would run as a Democrat against this incumbent if I was guaranteed that I couldn't win, because I didn't want to be a probate judge. They said, you can't possibly win. So I did that, and I didn't win, but I did better than Governor Dempsey, which was kind of amazing in those days. And I lost, but in the course of my campaign...
You mean you did better than Governor Dempsey in your
I
town?
lost by less
than
he did.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
And that was at a time when the Democrats ran the state, except these little pockets of Republicans. And in Essex in those days, I went door to door for a while. When I got to Ivoryton, which is part of Essex, I knocked on the door of a family, and they said they couldn't believe a Democrat was doing this. And they said it was not long before that if you registered as a Democrat in this factory where they worked, you'd get fired. But, so then I went back to being my housewife and doing my title searching. But in the course of my campaign, I had met Senator Jack Pickett, who was the co-chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He was the brother-in-law of a friend of mine from Essex. And unbeknownst to me, Senator Pickett had negotiated for me to become the law clerk for the Judiciary Committee in the 1967 session. And so he called me up and said, congratulations, you're my new law clerk. And I said, what's a law clerk? But that turned out to be one of the most wonderful experiences I ever had. And again, your question about child care, it was horrendous. I remember leaving my kids one long day with the 16-year-old high school dropout, and when I got home it was after dark. She had gotten herself locked out of the house, and the children and she were in a little study attached to the garage with no heat. I think they were eating M&Ms because there wasn't any other food. I felt a little guilty about that.
But that was just we have a part-time legislature.
Right. It was 5 months, maybe 3 or 4 days a week. That's right. But it turned out to be a very fortuitous session of the legislature, because in May of 1967, the Galt decision was decided, which said there shall be due process in juvenile courts, which there hadn't been since its founding, at the turn of the century. And so the legislature, in a matter of days, passed a bill that the juvenile court had, which was then only 3 judges in the whole state, including Margaret Driscoll, who was the first woman judge in Connecticut, and Tom Gill from West Hartford.
And who was the third?
At the time, I think it was Judge McClendon, whom I didn't really know. And they had been asking to have more judges appointed because in the 60s, in the earlier 60s, child abuse syndrome had come out of the closet, so there was a lot more filings of neglect cases, and the legislature didn't heed their pleas until the Galt decision. So then they gave another 3 judges to this court for the whole state. And I had become known to the people that name judges in the legislature. So that's how I was considered.
And so what year were you appointed?
Well, 67, they passed the law at the end of May of 67. The legislative session ended in June, and Judge Satter, who was then the counsel to the Democratic majority in the House, suggested that I put my name in, and my first response was, "Oh, Bob, I can't do that. Amy's only 2." And he said, "Go home and talk to your husband about it." So I went down to Essex and didn't talk to my husband, and Bob called the next day and said, "Did you talk to Russell?" I said, "No." He said, "Would you?" I said, "Okay." And when I suggested to Russell what Bob had suggested to me, if he had said, "Don't you think we should wait until Amy's in first grade?" I would have agreed 100%, and that would have been the end of it.
So how old was Amy?
She didn't turn 3 until the end of June. And Russell said, "Go for it, because this is not going to come along again." And so it really is, you know, when I say I'm not a feminist, it's because I owe so much of my career to the good guidance of the men in my life, starting with my father and Bob Satter and Russell Brenneman.
And, well, how did becoming a juvenile court judge change your life?
Oh, my God. For one thing, the law in those days said every judge has to be a resident of the judicial district in which he sits. There were 3. The state was divided up into 3 districts. Governor Dempsey had leaked the names of 3 of us, and we all lived in Middlesex County. So 2 of us were going to have to move. Judge Mike Conway, with 5 kids, had just bought a new house, so Judge Glass and I said, "We'll move." So my husband agreed that we would move to Hartford County, and Bob Glass was going to then move to Litchfield County, which entailed my husband having a horrendous commute. Instead of going along the shore from Essex to New London, where his practice was, he was going to have to drive from Hartford to New London. In those days, it didn't even have as much of the fast road as it does now. It was a
Yeah, it's still not that easy to
No,
get
it's
from Hartford to
not.
New London.
But he agreed that he would do that. And so we went looking for a house. We hit Glastonbury because it's the first town with a sort of an excellent school system that we could hit driving up on that not fast road. And then I got I think you'd like this, Susan. Got a telephone call in my kitchen, my little tiny kitchen in Essex, and it was John Bailey. And he said, "I hear you want to be a judge." And I wound up by saying to him, "If you guarantee that I'll be appointed, we will move to Hartford County, but I don't want to put my husband through this if I don't have that guarantee." I think I even deigned to say, "Would you put that in writing?" And Bailey said to me, "My word is considered good enough for most people." And later on at our swearing in, the 3 of us were all sworn in by the governor at the same time. John Bailey said to Bob Satter, "She almost blew it with that phone call."
And that when you said when the governor swore you in, that was Governor Dempsey.
That was Governor Dempsey, and because we all had young children, or at least Mike Conway and I had quite young children, we asked that the governor swear us all in. There'd be a certain amount of ceremony, because I wanted the kids to know why Mom wasn't going to be home from now on. And there's a photograph, which is in that Harvard Law School bulletin I gave you, of the swearing in with my kids, who were then 7, 6, and 3, and the gov and my husband. And it's quite I didn't realize at the time what a historic document that would prove to be.
And you assumed your position, and you went to work in Hartford.
That's right. I was sworn in, and I don't know, like the next day, I drove in from our new house in Glastonbury to 322 Washington Street, which is where the old juvenile court had been since its founding in 1941. It was an old, brick mansion on Washington Street, and the courtroom was the front parlor that had 3 birch logs in it, which had been in the same position since 1941, as far as I know.
Is that building still there?
It's still there. I think it was used for a while for nurses' housing, and I don't know what it's used for now.
Do you remember what number Washington Street it was?
322, yeah. And again, it's like when I went to that first class at Harvard Law School and suddenly something went click, this is right. So I walked into that funny old building, you know, and met Judge Gill and met the director of probation and met the probation officers and so forth. And it just was, I just felt at home because, well, for one thing, it was about people and it was about issues that were not concerned with money, but about human lives. And this is what's always interested me. And it just felt, it felt right.
And how did you learn to be a juvenile judge?
Oh boy, it was difficult. I mean, I had done no litigation. The only moot court we had at Harvard in the 50s was appellate stuff. I would feel quite comfortable arguing a case in the U.S. Supreme Court, but I couldn't take a case through small claims, you know. So I kind of learned from my side of the bench, and the first trials were excruciating for the lawyers and for me because somebody would say, I object, and I'd say, really? Why? And he'd give a reason. I'd turn to the other lawyer and say, well, how do you respond to that? Oh, really? That's interesting. How do you respond? So then I got a little feedback. We don't care how she rules on evidence. We just want her to get on with the trial. So then I discovered that I'm really very interested in evidence, and I'm pretty good at figuring things out, and I've been reversed, but never an evidentiary ruling.
So you learned on the job, it was OJT.
I learned on the job. That's right. And the amount of self-confidence that my daughter shows in her television role, it took me 15 or 20 years to get.
And what do you think it was in your life that prepared you for that job?
Oh, that's awfully hard to say. I think I've always been a very people-oriented person. I think I got this from my mother. She was extremely empathetic to people of all levels of education, economics, and so forth, and I would like to be like her. I think I am to some extent. I'm a word person, so that writing opinions was a challenge for me that I really enjoyed fulfilling. I mean, and I also like explaining things to people in a way that they understand, and I felt that I was performing a function in explaining to these very troubled people who were losing their children one way or another what was happening, why it was happening, what they could do about it. And I've gotten some feedback that some of them were helped to understand this rather mystifying process. I guess I've always been concerned about, maybe because of my depression childhood, concerned about people who are unfortunate, who need things, and how we can help them. And
did you work, was it a 5-day-a-week job
yes,
in those days?
It definitely was, and we had Hartford, Windham, and Talent counties, so 2 days a week I would go to Willimantic and Rockville, and 2 days a week I'd go to New Britain and Bristol, and the other 3 days both Judge Gill and I would be in Hartford, so we only overlapped 1 day.
And how did it feel? You were the second woman in Connecticut history to be appointed to a statewide court. And how did that feel, or how did that change your life?
I think it was a statewide court, but it was a separate court, definitely an inferior court, and there would have been a woman there, Judge Driscoll, since 1960. I think if I had been appointed to the Superior Court, especially with my lack of litigation practice and so forth, I would have felt over my depth. But as it was, I worked just with one judge, Judge Gill, and he was an absolute prince. He was brilliant, compassionate, a wonderful teacher. I just can't say enough about the tutelage that I got from him. So that was our little empire, was in this little building, and 2 judges. He would call meetings of all of the juvenile court judges, all 6 of us, periodically, and so I got to know the others. But it was not part of the great big thing, which didn't happen until 1978.
And that's when the courts merged, and
that's when the courts merged, and there was some feeling that the juvenile court should not be in the merger. I felt, although I knew that we would lose the autonomy, you know, we had the power to hire, to make policies, to do teaching. We had wonderful things going on in the juvenile court. We knew we'd lose them all, but we were an inferior court. I mean, we could definitely an inferior court. Appeals were taken not on the record, but as trials de novo in the superior court by judges who didn't have any background in this. And we would sometimes get a very complicated trial set up. I remember once, having a dried blood expert from Scotland Yard flown over for a probable cause hearing in a murder case. And in a case like that, we'd get a call from a lawyer saying, "I can't come, I've been called into the real court today." And it was a little hard to argue with that because we were an inferior court. So I figured we can't be an inferior court anymore. The juveniles, kids have to be treated with the same dignity, the same quality of the judges as everybody else. So I think of the 6 of us, 4 of us felt we should go into the merger and 2 didn't. But not that we had the last word about it. That was the decision. But I think it was exactly the right thing to do. And over the long haul, after many difficulties, I think it has been good for the way juveniles are treated. I have to tell you, Susan, and you've sat in juvenile, it's still regarded as an inferior assignment. It's not an inferior court. Those of us who get hooked by it don't want to leave it. And thank heaven there are a number of those. Never enough. And I think the most disheartening thing for staff is when somebody comes in and says, "I didn't ask for this assignment, I don't want to be here," and that's too bad. So I think over time, because it is a superior court assignment, because there is rotation out, you're not stuck forever, and because of Amy's show, hopefully the status will rise and we'll get more and more people who want to be there.
Yeah, I want to get back to that. I remember when I was sitting in the juvenile court, lawyers would come in from time to time and say, "Well, Your Honor, it's now 10:30 and I have a matter in the Superior Court." And I would look at them and say, "This is a Superior Court."
Exactly.
And I think that you're right, that there's still that mentality. But, you probably more than anyone else who's been in the juvenile court, I think really has that wonderful appreciation of how important the work is that goes on in the juvenile court. And, you obviously had the opportunity when the courts did merge in 1978 to sit in other assignments. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about how you felt that those assignments compared with the juvenile assignment?
Well, that's a good question. Because of my lack of practice experience, I was very hesitant to go into the civil court or even the adult criminal courts. I had assumed that those of us who were nutty enough to raise our hands every 6 months and say, "I want to stay in juvenile," would be permitted to stay. I know in many county merged systems that's the way it is. Same guy, 20 years, says, "I want to be in juvenile." And that's the way it was the first 6-month assignment. The second 6-month assignment, I was sent out to the GA in Rockville. And I thought there's been a clerical error. But I think Justice Speziale and Judge Sponza, who were sort of running the merger, felt, and frankly, I think they were absolutely right, and I think we've gotten away from this a little bit recently in judicial administration, that judges were kind of fungible, that every judge ought to be able to walk into any courtroom and acquit himself at least reasonably well. And I think that was terribly important for me, so I went reluctantly. Jack Shea, who was presiding in Rockville at that time, who later resigned to become a magnate of industry, was very gentle with me, put me into the GA criminal court first, and that was enough like delinquency so that I didn't make a fool of myself, and then into the family court, which was enough like the neglect concerns. The awful moment came when he said, "Okay, it's time for you to go into the civil short calendar." And I didn't know anything about the civil short calendar, and I said, "Well, what if they want to foreclose a mortgage?" He said, "This is what you do, You ask them what their law day is, and then you say subsequent creditors in inverse order or something like that. And I said, what does that mean? He said, never mind, just go out and say it. So I did that. I went out and I said it, and everybody was perfectly satisfied, folded up their papers and left. And then I went home and read the bench book and found out what I had done, which was correct. But what I discovered was, especially when we had a few trials on the adult side, was that the standard of justice that we had been practicing in juvenile was very high, that we observed all of the rules of evidence. I think due process was exquisitely well observed, especially because all parties in neglect cases have to have attorneys, whether they can afford it or not. And that's not always true in the divorce court, and sometimes to the detriment of children's custody issues. When I finally was permitted, after being banished for a number of years, 5 years I guess, to different assignments, I came back feeling that this is not an inferior assignment in any respect, that we have a very high standard of justice. What we don't have is the doors open to the public.
Right. And what do you think about that? I mean, I've given that a lot of thought, and in many ways I think that the fact that the juvenile court is closed, in some ways I understand that it's a blessing, but on the other hand, it's somewhat of a curse too, not having the ability, just not having the public or the General Assembly really knowing what goes on and the complexity and difficulties.
I agree with you, and occasionally there have been court watchers. I know the Quakers had a court watcher program, and I was so glad to see them, to have a critical eye on what we did. The problem is, although I think the juvenile court is fast disappearing, especially on the delinquency side, I wouldn't be surprised to see it open to the public later. The theory was that children can change, and children, I think, are prisoners of their life circumstances. They don't choose their parents, they don't choose their neighborhoods or their schools. An adult criminal has the right to move and pick other associates. He can make a lot of autonomous decisions. Kids can't. So if you have a child, and I think there's some statistics that show 85% of first referred delinquents are never referred a second time. Why have that publicized? Why not let them make their childish mistakes? I'll grant you the 15% who are repeat and more serious offenders should have public trials, and in fact they do now, because they're all getting transferred upstairs.
Yes. What did you get paid when you, by the way, when you first became a juvenile judge?
$17,000. I thought it was huge.
And was that less than what the Superior Court judges got in those days?
Oh, quite a bit, yeah.
And
in fact, I think that's why I got the nod from Governor Dempsey, because he had announced in advance he wanted one of the 3 new judges to be a woman. And I believe that he looked first to women with an established practice. And they were earning a lot more money and were not interested. So I didn't have the practice experience, but I looked good on paper.
Now, did you have a confirmation hearing before the judiciary? Did you appear before the Judiciary Committee as judges do now?
Right. I don't remember much about it. I remember my reappointment interviews more.
But you didn't have to fill out a written application?
No. And when somebody said nowadays you have to send copies of your last 5 appellate court briefs, what?
Right. You have to identify your 10 most significant cases.
Exactly. But my answer to that is Judge Burns had not practiced law, and she had had a different kind of legal career, and she was a wonderful judge, is a wonderful judge. Justice Peters had been a professor. She hadn't practiced law.
Right.
So I am not sure that that is necessarily the criterion for an excellent judge. And in fact, I think in Japan and in Europe, some places, you have 3 tracks in law school: the solicitor, the barrister, and the magistrate. And you start training as a law student to be a magistrate. And frankly, in defense of my lack of background, if you've been a plaintiff's attorney, doing civil litigation, it seems to me to be very hard to do pre-trials, let's say, or negotiate settlements without having a tilt in one direction or the other. I'm sure it's possible, but it might be more difficult. I came totally ignorant and of any tilt And I think it worked out. It just took me 20 years to learn the business. That's all.
Now, do you think that women bring a different perspective to the bench than men?
I'm sure they do. I don't know enough about psychology to tell you how. I think in juvenile matters, I have a theory. A lot of men judges who are excellent in juvenile emotionally can't take it, that they take the problems home and they anguish over the conditions of the children. This is absolutely no basis for my feeling this, but I think women are more able to empathize with children. Maybe it's because they spend more time with young children. And when you look at it from the child's perspective, not from the deprivation of the parent, from loss of his child, but what does this child need, I think maybe it's easier for a woman to make the decision without anguish, without anguishing so much. I don't know why. But I know I've heard more complaints from male judges about how emotionally taxing the assignment is than I have from the women.
Right, and I think too that some I've heard some male judges comment that it's easier for them to do delinquency than it is for them to do neglect and child abuse. So, I've often thought of that too.
Yes. I think that's the reason, though, because delinquency is really like criminal court. I mean, your first concern probably should be the protection of the public. But in the neglect case, your concern is for the welfare of the child. That's all you're focused on, even if you have to deprive the parent of this very sacred right to raise their children.
And I think that's, when you really think about it, and I know that when I first started in the juvenile court, I just had to step back and was just really awed by the fact that you, in that court, as a judge, you were really dealing with the most important and fundamental relationships in life. And what could be, here we were in these little courtrooms, in these little courthouses, and that were closed to the public. And really the problems in that court were really among the biggest problems.
Exactly.
And really involved the most people and the most resources, because everybody did have a lawyer, and then there would be guardians ad litem and social workers and advocates of different sorts.
And unlike when there's a criminal issue, whether it's delinquency or adult, there's no right and wrong. There's no yes, he did it, or no, he didn't do it. For the most part, it's best interests, The parent takes drugs. Is that a reason to take the child away? If it's a little tiny infant, maybe so. If it's a 12-year-old who's survived through this for 12 years, maybe not. What if the child is 6 or 8? I mean, there's gradations. There's no black and white.
So I take it then that, since you've gone back to, after your sojourn in the outer reaches of the Superior Court jurisdiction, you wanted to come back to juvenile, and now, you're a referee, and you can choose what you want to do.
Right.
And, you still do. You still are involved very much in the juvenile court.
When I came back full-time to juvenile in 1985 in Hartford, which is my home court, I chose to just do the neglect cases. Already the delinquency side was getting to be more and more like adult criminal court and less focused on the child. So I've done pretty much nothing but neglect for the last 15 years. And then when I took senior judge status, I think it was 1992 or 93, I began to work less, but I stayed in the neglect side. And now as a referee, I'm doing a lot of judicial pre-trials, trying to resolve cases. And of course, my 33 years on the bench lends tremendous weight, because I say, oh, I had a case like that in 1971, and you know what happened to that. So.
And, obviously those wonderful, I know that I often thought, if I weren't so busy when I was sitting in the juvenile court all day, every day, with these complex and difficult cases, it would be they would make fascinating stories.
Television stories.
Television stories.
Exactly.
And now, with your daughter and you, are doing this and developing these wonderful and important storylines, and it's turned into a hit television series.
Well, that was a big surprise, I think, to all of us.
And tell us how that evolved.
Well, it's interesting. I had thought for a long time, I love the show Law and Order, and I had thought for a long time that the neglect courtroom would be a wonderful place to have a law and order kind of a program where you would start by the intake process, whether it's a school that picked up a child with stripes on his back from a beating, or a neonatal nurse in a hospital where there's cocaine baby born, or the police station where domestic violence had broken out, something like that. And then you'd follow the social worker into the intake, investigation, and finally, at the end, it would come into the judge's courtroom.
Yeah.
And I envisioned the judge to be some old bag about 70-something. Well, meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, Amy had been talking to her manager about the fact that actresses and actors are kind of victims of whatever they're offered. You know, Amy did a good job in a certain kind of a program, so she gets offered jobs like that. When she was offered a guest spot on Frasier, they said after they filmed it, "Amy, you can do comedy." And she said, "I know I can do comedy. Nobody ever gave me any." So they decided, she and her manager, to create a television role that would permit her to be funny and tragic and romantic and motherly and businesslike and lawyer-like and so forth. And at that time, which was 1996, she and her husband were, unbeknownst to me, filming a This Is Your Life video to celebrate my 70th birthday. And they went up, among other places, to the juvenile court in Hartford and talked to sheriffs and probation officers and court reporters and people that I had worked with for years. And Amy was struck at the quality of that atmosphere, everybody working together on very difficult things, but with comradeship and so forth. And she thought, this would be a good place to put my character. So when it began to gel, she said, "I'm sorry, Ma, but the judge is not going to be the 70-year-old tart-tongued bag. It's going to be a 35-year-old, played by me." So it's a very different kind of thing. She kept saying, "This is not going to be Law and Order," and it's not.
And what has your involvement been?
Well, they let me read the first drafts of the scripts, and I don't want to be on the masthead or get paid because they don't always follow my recommendations. But I try to make it technically correct for Connecticut, and lots of times they don't care. I mean, if you notice, Amy has divorce jurisdiction.
Yes,
Sometimes
yes,
she
I
has
noticed she's...
adoption.
Right.
When I got the script where she was doing a civil jury, I really said, you can't do this. There has to be a reason why she's doing civil jury. So they did listen to me and had her subbing for another judge. But I also feed them ideas for stories based upon our cases and invite all my colleagues to do the same. And I'm, constantly getting clippings or suggestions, and they consume material. As you know, the plot lines are so short. They consume material at a tremendous rate. And every month her research guy publishes sort of a 6-page sheet of ideas that come from all over. This is a delinquency case and involves this kind of a thing and this situation. And so some of my ideas have gotten across. Some of the ideas of my colleagues have gotten filmed.
And the success of the show, obviously.
I don't understand it. I mean, actually, if it hadn't been for the Columbine tragedy, it probably wouldn't have been on, because CBS had lined up a number of shoot-'em-ups for the fall of '99. And then after Columbine, they decided perhaps we'd better soft pedal to that kind of violence. And Amy thought it was between either her show and Family Law, and then CBS decided to put them both on. And the writer is a genius, the head writer. She has a staff, but she manages to get the personalities of the family members down so beautifully. And so it's to me, it's a very interesting show, because I will find myself laughing out loud and in tears all in the same hour between ads.
Between the commercial breaks.
Right. And I think that's sort of unusual, and that's exactly what Amy had in mind, that it would be funny. She said, "I want the show to be funny," and I said, "How can a show about child abuse be funny?" But the family parts are very funny, and some of the court parts are funny, too.
Now, is Judge Amy Gray your kind of judge?
In lots of ways, she is. Sometimes, and I don't talk to the writers, but sometimes Amy will present something or make a decision which is the way I feel I would. I even said to her recently, lots of times you sound so much like me, and you haven't observed me that often in court. And she said something about, I pick up a lot or something like that. So I think in some ways she and I have the same style on the bench. But I'll tell you a funny anecdote. We've been on the set with her a number of times, and it's great fun to watch. One day, Russell and I came on the set and happened to be walking past the door into the courtroom when Amy was presiding, and she saw me. She wasn't expecting to see me, and she froze, which never happens. She's such a pro. And she said it was, afterwards, that it was the funniest thing. It was the first time she had ever found herself playing me and then looking at me in the flesh, and it was just sort of disturbing for a minute.
And what is your hope for judging Amy?
Well, I had said in the beginning I want it to be a critical success and a commercial failure because I didn't want her to get stuck for 5 years, but it looks like it's going to be a commercial success too. I hope it winds up with dignity in not too many years. I hope it doesn't go 9 years like Seinfeld did, because she has so many things that she wants to do. On the other hand, she achieved what she set out to do. She's given herself an opportunity to demonstrate the kind of acting that she can do, the tremendous range that she has. And I think that's wonderful. In fact, she was at the Cannes Film Festival with a movie that unfortunately will not have theater release. It was a movie called Things You Can Tell by Looking at, just by looking at her, with Callista Flockhart and Glenn Close and a whole bunch of Holly Hunter famous actresses. Callista Flockhart said to Amy, "You're so lucky. I have no input into what Ally McBeal says or does." But Amy's a producer of the show, and her character will be shaped to some extent by what she wants it.
Now, you said something before, a little bit earlier, about how, when we were talking about the fact that the juvenile court is closed and how so few of the issues and cases really get publicized and recognized for the importance, their importance to the lives of human beings on a daily basis, that you see the show to some extent as a vehicle
bully
to do
pulpit.
this.
My bully pulpit, exactly. For example, the recent politicization of DCF, the fact that children are being snatched predictably because if there's a wrong guess, there are ugly headlines and people get fired. Well, that bothers me as a lawyer. It bothers me tremendously to have something, as you said, that's as fundamentally important as being able to raise your child interrupted because the social worker out in the field with maybe 2 years' experience thinks the child is at risk. But that's an issue that is very hard to bring across to the public, and I think Amy's show can do it better than anything I can say.
Now, you're sitting there with a script in your lap, and it's a script. Well, why don't you tell us about the script?
Well, I told you how the all-women's reunions at Harvard are now every 5 years. So after meeting in 78 and 88, we then started to meet in 93. In 98, Amy was already pretty well known, even though this show hadn't started. And she was asked if she would come to the reunion and just talk about what it was like to grow up when your mom was a judge. So she wrote this little thing with apologies to Paula Vogel, how I learned to be a judge's daughter. And then, of course, it turned out she couldn't come in the fall of 98 because she was filming something. And so a woman of her vintage, who had graduated from the law school 10 years before, read it with me. And we got a lot of very positive feedback from women in their 30s and 40s who were practicing law and trying to raise little kids and never feeling good enough at either one or the other, but unwilling to abandon either pursuit. And I think she really got it right.
Well, I think she did, and it's not very long, and so as we discussed on the break, we're going to try, you and I, even though I've only read it. I've read it a couple of times. I've certainly never rehearsed it, but I'll do my best to do the Amy part. And I just want to read the introduction. It says, "This should be performed in the manner of How I Learned to Drive." It's called How I Learned to Be a Judge's Daughter by Amy Brenneman. And it's supposed to go something like this: on a bare stage with the Amy character on one side and the mom character on the other. They should stand, scripts in hands. We're going to sit.
Okay.
And they should split their focus between talking to the audience and each other, following the flow of the script. And lights up, the actresses address the audience. And Amy starts. "There are first the memories that aren't mine, that couldn't be mine, because they precede me. There is a letter I found."
Dear Mommy and Daddy, Russell and I are doing well. We just received our grades from last semester. We were thrilled with Russell's B+, quite an improvement from last time. I received an A. The trees are just now budding along the Charles. More later. Love, Babe.
Harvard Law School, 1952. My mother was in the first class of women admitted there. When she and my father married after their first year, they were, by default, the first married couple at HLS, an honor I always liked just as much or more. Mom had graduated from Radcliffe 3 years before, held tedious jobs, partied in Greenwich Village, and watched her girlfriends all marry off. At 24, the panic of spinsterhood enveloped her. When she heard that the law school was accepting women, she applied, figuring,
My life is going nowhere, and I've always loved Cambridge.
or sometimes,
I don't have to write a thesis if I go to law school.
in the old standby.
If I'm going to be an old maid, I might as well have a career.
She met my father in October of the first year.
A chorus of children's voices.
My mother is a housewife. My mother is a teacher's aide. My mother is a nurse. My mother is a juvenile court judge. There were losses, I suppose. My mom knows what they were more than I.
Not baking cookies in the afternoon. Not seeing Amy run her cross country, her track meets. Not being able to pick her up at piano lesson until 2 hours after she finished. Could you sit and do homework, Amy, with the daughter of your piano teacher whom you don't really like?
Do I have a choice?
Not being there, that was the loss. Not being there for what might come.
Sometimes in my snarkiest, brattiest, angriest mood when she would ask me,
Would you prefer that I not work, Aim?
I'd say yes,
Ow.
and see what she'd do. I didn't do that very often because somewhere I knew that if I really asked her to, she would quit. And I didn't want her to quit because I knew how much she loved her work, like I loved acting and running. I didn't want someone ever to tell me not to do what I loved. When my mother was appointed to the Connecticut bench in 1967, she was reticent. She worried about moving us to Hartford County, she worried about being away from her growing children, and she worried about the fact that she didn't know what the hell she was doing. My father spoke the sacred words, invoked on many occasions during my own life.
Just try it. If you don't like it, you can always quit.
Behind every great woman is a man who is more of a feminist than she, who carries the fearlessness that is waiting to be born.
I am not a feminist, Aim. I don't know what that word means.
Whatever, Ma.
And I did see you run track once, don't you remember?
Oh, that was so awful.
You were running in Bristol?
No, Tolland, I think. Tolland High School, and it was raining. Oh, God, and I was running the 2-mile, the 8 hideous laps.
I felt so bad for you, sweetie. You got a stitch.
I never get stitches.
And I watched you in agony for lap after lap.
You were the only spectator in the stands, I think, in your work clothes and raincoat. Did you have your robe on, too?
And I felt terrible for you. You were in so much pain.
I truly never get stitches. It was all your fault.
But I was so proud. Where did my athletic daughter come from? Not from my genes, that's for sure.
That was a good year for me. I did a 5:20 mile.
Where did you come from, my athletic, talented daughter? The daughter with the long waist and the ready smile, who is stubborn in her beliefs and too kind to strangers. Where did you come from, daughter of mine?
From you, Ma. I come from you.
I wake up at 3:30 a.m. in a panic. Amy has to bring a snack to Brownies today, and I have precisely 4 hours to make it happen before she leaves for school. I trundle downstairs. The dog wakes up with a start. I have nothing. No cookie mix, no cake mix. If I scrounge, I can eke out sour cream cake from what's in my kitchen. I eke and send Amy off with this cake, which tastes, I admit, a little...
Weird.
Sophisticated, not weird. It's an adult dessert. What can I say? It's...
Weird.
It was the best I could do, Aim.
I knew that. I know that. That's why when I saw the other brownies, especially Kathleen, scrunch up their faces and say, "This cake is weird," I felt for all of us. I felt for the brownies because they didn't get a normal snack. I felt for me because everyone knew that I had brought the weird snack. And I felt for Mom because she got up at 3:30 and did the best she could. No other brownie had a mom judge. They didn't understand. There were no other mom judges then.
Amy used to think that everyone called me Honey because memos were addressed to the H.O.N. Frederica Brenneman.
I imagined a kinder, gentler court system.
She'd tell everyone she wanted to be a ballerina nurse judge.
I like diversity.
She'd always get up late during high school, so I'd have to drive her to school.
In her bathrobe, in a car with the seal of the state of Connecticut on it.
If I told them once, I told them 1,000 times.
This is not a third family car. It can only be used for my work. Whatever, Ma.
Is she making fun of me?
And the best news, that which truly sent me to ecstasy, was getting a call from Mom around 2:30 p.m.
The
saying,
trial got postponed. I'm coming home.
the freebie, the treat unforeseen. We'd go to school, we'd go to the pool club, or shopping, or to the mall, asking ourselves.
Isn't this what mothers and daughters do?
We were never sure, you see.
I don't cry in public often. It's just not something that I do.
It's true, she doesn't.
But when I saw Amy play Salve and Peer Gynt,
Oh, Mom, come on.
now I want to tell this. Amy played Salve, who waits for Peter all those years. Well, she made me cry. She did.
I remember her hitting me in the arm, almost yelling at me, "You made me cry."
I was watching someone do what they were put on this earth to do.
It's like her on the bench. I've come into her court when there have been bickering lawyers, screaming children, confusing dockets, and there she is, presiding with wisdom and compassion. It's an awesome sight. Watching someone use the best, most generous, most intuitive part of themselves. We both have work like that, my mother and I.
We have more than work, Amy.
Oh yeah, we have husbands.
And children?
Soon, Ma, soon.
When people used to ask me how I did everything, I'd answer, not very well. If I weren't a judge, I'd be a better mother. If I weren't a mother, I suppose I'd be a better judge.
But maybe life isn't about being perfect, Mom, but accepting yourself for doing the best you can, like the sour cream cake.
Like Pied Beauty.
By Gerard Manley Hopkins, favorite poem of my mom's.
It goes something like this. Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of couple color of a brinded cow, for rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut balls, finches' wings, landscape plotted in peace to fold, fallow, and plow, and all trades their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange, whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift slow, sweet sour, a dazzle dim. He fathers forth whose beauty is past change. Praise him.
Could it possibly be that life isn't about perfection? Could it be that we need to accept ourselves more and try less hard? That we are free to challenge ourselves to be many things, mother, daughter, wife, artist, professional, go-getter, only if we also challenge ourselves to cut a little slack. That what we are loved for is not our accomplishments, but the chinks in our armor. That the final result of our brief visit here is not our careers or marriages or families, but the legacy of our own courageous spirits.
That would be too easy.
Well, that's a great, there's so much of that, I think, that really captures, what life is like for women and careers and raising children and trying to, to balance the two and hope that you have the luck and the good fortune of your child turning out well.
And that you have to accept the imperfections. I think that's the big message.
And hope that your child comes
will
to
appreciate
accept
that.
Will appreciate that and come to except yours. There's some wonderful quotes in here, and I have to ask you about a couple of them. The one is that you say that, you know, you're not a feminist, and I'm not a feminist, Amy. I don't know what that word means. And I want to ask you about that. Because, you know, in many ways, from my perspective, you are a feminist. Because you have done all those, you know, the wonderful fundamental things that women have always done, and you've done more.
I guess I'm not sure what a feminist is, because, you know, in the early days of the movement, I would think of strident women marching, you know, with banners and whatnot, and I never marched with banners. I guess I wasn't afraid to do the things that women had been barred from doing as soon as the door opened a little crack. But like my friend who went back across the river from the Harvard Business School, I would not have made a noise if I had tried something and been turned down. And I guess that's what I think a feminist would do, is to make the noises.
But don't you think that your story is a good one for feminists?
Well, I think you, if it tells women, don't be afraid to go out and try to get what you want, there are no barriers to that, or there should not be barriers. But I never had the experience of wanting something and being told I couldn't have it because I was a woman, and then I don't know what I would have done. I just happened to be there when the door first opened a crack. I mean, that was fortuity.
Well, that's interesting, because there are many, many stories of many doors closing on women after you, after your time.
I suppose. I mean, I don't know. I could say, well, I've had the same job for 33 years. I've never been promoted. I've never been named to an appellate court. I've never been an administrative judge. The only time I was a presiding judge is when there was only 2 of us. But that could be me. There's a lot of male judges who have never had any of these opportunities either. And in fact, with my people-loving bent, although I love legal problems and I love the intellectual challenge of almost any kind of law, I wouldn't want to give up the courtroom for the appellate court. I don't think I would have wanted that. And so it's hard to say. If you don't want something and you're not offered it, I don't know whether that's something to be unhappy about.
But it seems to me that in many ways you really are at the top of your profession, because you are, you have the respect and awe of those folks, who have followed you. So I think in that way, the promotion has really come from within, I guess, is what, and that's really, the most important type of recognition or promotion.
Well, I think you're right, and I think I'm most flattered when I get told by lawyers and court services officers and sometimes probation officers and frequently social workers that they learned a lot from me, and I guess I like imparting what I've learned over a long time to other people so that they can do their jobs better, and I have been given feedback on that, which makes me very happy.
And so if you were to give advice to young women today entering the legal profession, this is a tough question, what do you think that advice would be?
Entering the legal profession. Now we've got law school behind them.
Right.
Okay.
Or well, I guess, why don't we go back a little bit further than that, now that you've mentioned that, contemplating a career in the law. So we're sort of pre-law school.
Well, I do encourage people to go to law school. I think it's such a broad profession. There are so many things you can do, both in government and business and public service and so forth. So my husband likes to discourage discourage people because he just thinks there's too many lawyers in the world, and there probably are, given those statistics I heard about Connecticut. But I say do it. It's a kind of the only graduate school I know that gives you somewhat of a general education for a lot of things. Then once you've got the law degree under your belt, what's happening to a lot of women, it's happening to a lot of men. I don't think I'd give any words of advice to women that I wouldn't give to men. The doors are open really now. The problem is that law school is so expensive, the loans are so enormous, and I mentor quite a number of women students at the Harvard Law School over the years. And in fact, I even went up for a one-day Wasserstein Fellowship where you're supposed to talk to students. All they wanted to talk about was balancing work and children and how do you do babysitters without feeling guilty and so forth. But what happens is you emerge from law school with $50,000 or $60,000 in debt. The only way to pay it off before you're old enough, for Social Security is to go to work for a big law firm and make a lot of money. And you're doing commercial contracts, big money law, when your heart is in the public sector. That's a terrible problem. And there's an article in Esquire magazine last August about what happened to the graduates of Harvard Law School from 1990. Large percentage have left the big Wall Street law firms that they went with because they were not having a life. Quite a large percent is leaving the practice of law altogether, and I think that's a shame and a great loss. So I guess my words of advice would be try to minimize your debts so that your choice of profession when you get out of law school will be dictated by your conscience and your heart, rather than by the need to rack up big bucks, because it's not going to be a satisfactory life. And I find the public sector, as you can see from my jobs before law school, I'm an old-fashioned Democrat who thinks that the government is we and not they, and that does change your perspective. To me, working in the public sector is the most satisfying law you can practice, to think that you're helping some lives be better and not just a few lives be richer. And that would be my advice, but that would be my advice to the males as well.
All right, I have one last question for you, and that is, what accomplishment among your life of many accomplishments are you the proudest of? In 1978, working with the some social workers, we started what turned into the Children in Placement program, which has now been in Connecticut since 1979, I guess, which trains volunteers to monitor cases of foster children or to serve as guardians ad litem for the foster children. And I'm proud that it's still alive and still going, and I think there's room for it to be even better than it is. I'm also pleased that I've been given an opportunity to do training of social workers and lawyers and judges, and I've written up things which would be helpful, short guides to them. And when I'm given feedback that I learned a great deal from you, I really feel that I've accomplished something in making the profession serve people better. Of course, every once in a while somebody will come up to me and say, "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you. You freed my child to be adopted by us, 20 years ago, and that's been the greatest thing that ever happened to us." I don't think that's anything special with me. I think any judge who's doing a job will get that kind of feedback as well. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.